The night exploded. I was getting ready for a date with Kate, but I found my stepmother Sarah in tears because of my stepfather. He had ignored her again. Her hand trembled when she touched mine, and I felt that it was not just support. Her eyes sparkled. My heart started to race. Behind his back, while he was sleeping, we crossed a line that should not have been there. Something dark, hot, dangerous flared up between us. And I knew that this was only the beginning of the hell that would consume us. Where will this secret lead? My name is Emily, and I was 22 years old that day, living in a small town in Texas with my dad and his wife, Sarah. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in early fall, and I was getting ready for a date with Kate, a girl from my college who I was in my biology class with. Kate was tall, with short brown hair, and we'd chatted after class a couple of times before I worked up the courage to ask her out of college. I was standing in front of the mirror in my room, trying on a black t-shirt and jeans, trying to see if I looked good enough for a first date. My dad was at work. He's a manager at a local construction company and often worked late, so it was just me and Sarah at home. Sarah was sitting in the living room, leafing through a magazine, and I decided to go down to her to ask for advice, because I was a little scared before meeting Kate. I walked into the room holding 2 pairs of sneakers, one white and one black, and asked Sarah which one would go better with my outfit. She put the magazine down, looked at me carefully, and said that the black sneakers looked more stylish and went well with jeans. Then she asked where I was going, and I told her that I was going on a date with a girl from college, because I had come out to her a long time ago. Sarah nodded, smiled, and said that she was happy for me, and then offered to talk if I wanted to, because such things can be nerve-wracking. We sat on the couch and I started telling her about Kate, how she laughed at my professor's jokes, how she once helped me with a lab assignment, and how I hoped I liked her as much as she liked me. Sarah listened carefully, without interrupting, and then asked if I was nervous about this being my first real date with a girl. I told her that I was nervous because I didn't know how to act and I was afraid that things wouldn't go the way I wanted. Then Sarah told me that the main thing was to be myself, and if Kate was right for me, she would know it, and if she wasn't, there was no need to worry. She spoke calmly, and I felt a little better because she sounded like she really understood what I was talking about. Then the conversation turned to more personal topics, and I asked Sarah if she had had relationships with girls, because I was curious how she dealt with such things at my age. She looked at me, was silent for a while, and then said that yes, she had experience with women, because she was bisexual, although she had never talked about it with her dad. I was surprised, but did not ask further, because I did not want to pry too deeply into her personal life. She added that if I needed to discuss something after the date, I could come to her, and this seemed sincere to me. I thanked her, got up from the couch and went to get ready, because time was running out. Before leaving, I looked at myself in the mirror one more time, put on my black sneakers like Sarah had suggested, and felt ready to meet Kate. Sarah wished me luck as I left the house, and I got into my old car to drive to the cafe where we had agreed to meet. At that moment, I didn't think about anything except how the date would go, and how I would tell Sarah about it if everything went well. Dad was supposed to be home late, so I knew that she would be the only one waiting for me at home, ready to listen to what had happened. I didn't know that this date would be the beginning of a completely different story, but I'll tell you about that later. That Saturday night, I was sitting in my old car in front of a small cafe in the center of our small town in Texas, where I had come to meet Kate. It was about 6 o'clock, the sun was already setting, and I could see people coming and going from the cafe while I tried to collect my thoughts before this important event for me. I decided to arrive a little earlier so as not to be late, parked my car in the parking lot next to the cafe and went inside, because waiting outside seemed too nervous and inappropriate at that moment. It was warm inside. There were wooden tables, soft lamps were burning, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee calmed me a little as I chose a seat by the window. I sat down at a table, ordered tea, because coffee would have increased my internal tension even more, and began to wait for Kate, glancing at the door every few minutes. She showed up promptly at 6, as we had arranged, and I recognized her immediately by her short brown hair and the blue jacket she often wore in college. She walked into the cafe, looked around the room, noticed me, smiled, and headed toward my table, and I waved at her so she knew exactly where I was sitting. She sat down across from me, took off her jacket, hung it over the back of her chair, and said she was glad to see me outside of class, and I said I was glad too, although my voice was shaking slightly with nerves. We started talking about college, about our professors, and I noticed that she seemed relaxed, which helped calm me down a little as I tried to keep the conversation going. I asked her how she managed to cope so easily with biology, and she told me that she simply loved this science since she was a child, and I nodded, listening to her with interest. After a while, the waiter brought her the coffee she ordered and we continued talking, but gradually I began to feel that something was wrong, although I couldn't immediately figure out what it was. She answered my questions, smiled, but her eyes often wandered away and she didn't ask me anything in return, which made me wonder if she was interested in me at all. I decided to try to move the conversation to more personal topics and asked if she liked watching movies, because I wanted to know more about her than just her studies. She said that yes, she liked, but didn't name any movies, and then looked at her watch and said that she would have to leave soon because she forgot something at home. I nodded, although inside I felt my mood begin to fall, because I realized that the date was not going as I had planned. We sat there for another 20 minutes, the conversation growing more strained, until she finally stood up, saying she had to go and thanking me for seeing her, though there was no warmth in her voice. I said it was nice seeing you, stood up to say goodbye, and she left, leaving me alone at the table with my tea unfinished and feeling disappointed. I sat there for a while longer, looking out the window at the people passing by, and realized that Kate probably wasn't as interested in me as I was in her, and that this date had been a waste of time. Then I paid the bill, picked up my things, and headed to the car to go home, because I didn't want to stay in the cafe any longer than I had to. It was dark when I got into the car, and I turned on the radio to take my mind off what had just happened, but I still felt depressed. Dad was at work, and I knew that the only person waiting for me at home was Sarah, who had promised to listen if anything went wrong, and I decided that I would tell her everything as soon as I got back. The drive home took about 15 minutes, and I parked outside the house, where the only light on was in the living room, which meant that Sarah was still up and waiting for me. After my disastrous date with Kate, I returned home around 8 p.m. and noticed that the only light on was in the living room. Dad was still at work, as usual on a Saturday, and I knew that only Sarah was waiting for me inside, promising to listen if anything went wrong. I parked the car, turned off the engine, sat in the dark for a few minutes to collect my thoughts, and walked out, feeling the evening air slightly refreshing after a stressful day. I unlocked the door with my key, walked in, took off my trainers, hung up my jacket and walked into the living room, where Sarah was sitting on the sofa with a mug of tea and watching TV with the sound turned down. She looked up, noticed me, and asked why I was back so early, probably expecting the date to last longer. I sat down next to her, put my bag on the floor, and told her that things hadn't gone as I'd hoped and that I hadn't wanted to stay in the cafe after Kate had left. Sarah turned off the TV, put her mug down, and turned to listen, and I began to tell her what had happened, from waiting in the cafe to Kate leaving half an hour later. I described how we'd talked about college, how she'd seemed less than interested, and then how she'd said she had to go, leaving me alone at the table with my tea still half drunk. Sarah listened attentively, didn't interrupt, nodded occasionally, and I could tell she was trying to understand how I felt after that evening. When I'd finished, she asked me if I thought Kate wasn't ready for a relationship or just wasn't right for me, and I said I thought it was both. She said that these things happen, especially on first dates, and that I shouldn't blame myself if things didn't go the way I wanted. Her words were calm, and I felt the tension ease a little, although the disappointment was still there. Then she offered to make me some tea to warm me up, and I agreed because I didn't want to go to my room and be alone with my thoughts right away. Sarah got up and went into the kitchen, and I heard the kettle boiling, and a few minutes later she returned with 2 mugs, one of which she placed in front of me. We sat in silence, drinking tea, and I noticed that she was looking at me thoughtfully, as if she wanted to add something, but was hesitating. Then she asked if I wanted to talk about something else to take my mind off things, and I said yes, although I didn't know what to say because my mind was still spinning around Kate. Then she started telling me about her own date that had also gone badly before she met Dad, and I was surprised that she wanted to share that with me. She told me how she had dealt with the rejection, but over time she had come to realize that it wasn't as important as it had seemed at the time, and I felt that her words were helping me cope with my mood a little. We talked for a while, and I noticed that Sarah was sitting closer to me than usual, but I didn't pay attention because I was too tired to think about anything else. When the clock struck 10, I said I was going to bed, thanked her for the tea and the conversation, got up from the sofa and went to my room. Before I left, I turned around and saw Sarah watching me go, but she didn't say anything, and I simply wished her good night and closed the door of my room behind me. As I lay in bed, I thought about how this evening could have turned out differently, but instead of a date with Kate, I got a conversation with Sarah that turned out to be unexpectedly important. I was pleased that she listened to me without judgment, and I decided that I would talk to her again tomorrow if my mood did not improve. Sleep came quickly, because I was tired from the emotions of this day, and I did not think that our conversations with Sarah would soon go beyond simple communication. The next morning after the bad date, I woke up late, around noon, because I didn't want to get up early and think about what happened the day before. Dad had already left for work, as he usually did on Sundays when he had extra shifts, and the house was quiet, except for the sound of Sarah cooking in the kitchen. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and remembering our conversation with her the night before, how she calmly listened to me and didn't try to give unnecessary advice. I was glad that she was there, and I decided to go downstairs to talk to her some more, because I still felt a little lost after Kate left our date. I got up, put on a home t-shirt and shorts, washed my face and went to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee was already filling the entire space. Sarah was standing at the stove, frying eggs, and turned around when she heard my footsteps, asking how I had slept since last night. I told her I had slept fine, but was still wondering what had gone wrong, and sat down at the table, watching her cook with her usual confidence. She placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of me, poured coffee into 2 mugs, and sat down opposite me, saying she was glad I had come down because she was bored at home alone. We started eating, and I asked her if she was often alone while Dad was at work, and she said yes, almost every day, because his schedule had gotten busier in recent months. She added that she was used to it, but sometimes she missed the company, and I nodded, understanding what she meant. Then she asked if I wanted to tell her anything more about yesterday or just move on, and I said I didn't know if I should even think about Kate because she clearly didn't want to hear more. Sarah said she was always there to listen if I needed to talk, and I felt like I could tell her more than I would normally tell anyone else. I started talking about how much I'd spent preparing for this date, picking out my clothes and asking her advice, and how it had all been for nothing because Kate hadn't even tried to get to know me. Sarah listened, occasionally refilling her coffee, and then told me that I deserved someone who would appreciate my efforts and not leave after half an hour. We finished breakfast and I offered to do the dishes because I wanted to keep my hands busy, and Sarah agreed and sat at the table watching me. While I was washing the dishes, she started telling me about herself, how lonely she was when she first moved here with her dad and how she had to get used to her new life. I asked her if she missed her friends or the past, and she said that sometimes she did, but now her life is here and she tries to find something good in it. It seemed to me that she was saying this with some kind of hint, but I didn't ask because I wasn't sure if I understood her words correctly. Then we went into the living room and sat on the couch and I turned on the TV but kept it on low because I wanted to continue the conversation and not just mindlessly watch something. Sarah was sitting next to me, closer than she had been the day before, and I noticed that she was looking at me longer than usual, but I didn't pay it much attention, thinking that she just wanted to make sure I was okay. I asked her how she dealt with being alone with her dad working so much, and she said that she read books, watched movies, and sometimes just sat and thought about how things could be different. Her voice was calm, but there was a longing in it, and I suddenly realized that we were alike in this desire to find something real. We talked for a while, and I told her that sometimes I felt like an outsider in this house because Dad was busy and I didn't have any close friends to share these thoughts with. Sarah said that I wasn't an outsider, and that she was glad I was there because I made it easier for her to get through these quiet days. I looked at her, and she smiled, but there was something else in her eyes that I couldn't quite place, and it made me think about how close we had become lately. The day passed quietly, we watched TV, drank coffee, and I didn't notice how dark it was until Sarah said that it was time to make dinner soon because Dad would be home in a couple of hours. I went to my room to change, but I was still thinking about the way Sarah looked at me and how her words stayed in my head longer than usual. I felt comfortable with her, and I decided that I would talk to her again tomorrow, because these conversations were becoming an important part of my day. As I lay in bed that evening, I realized that I was starting to see her as more than just a stepmother, but someone who understood me better than I expected. The day after my conversation with Sarah, I woke up feeling like I wanted to spend more time with her because the day before had left me feeling warm and calm. Dad left for work early in the morning, as always, and I heard his car drive away while I was still in bed, thinking about what to say to Sarah when I got downstairs. I got up, put on some house clothes, washed my face, and went to the kitchen where she was already sitting with a cup of coffee and scrolling through her phone, not noticing my arrival right away. I said good morning, and she looked up, smiled, and said she was glad to see me, then offered to make me breakfast if I was hungry. I agreed, because I didn't want to turn down her attention, and sat at the table, watching her make an omelette. While she was standing at the stove, I asked her what her plans were for the day, and she said nothing special, just cleaning and maybe reading a book if she had time. I said I could help with the cleaning because I had nothing to do anyway, and she nodded, saying it would be nice to do it together instead of alone like we usually did. We ate scrambled eggs and toast, drank coffee, and I noticed that she was looking at me more often than before, but now it didn't seem random to me, and I began to think that something was changing between us. After breakfast, we cleared the table, and I suggested that we start in the living room, because there was the most dust there, and she agreed and got the vacuum cleaner from the pantry. We were cleaning together, I was wiping the shelves and she was vacuuming the carpet, and I noticed that we were exchanging glances sometimes, but neither of us said anything special, we just worked in silence. Then she asked me to help her move the couch to clean under it, and when we did, she accidentally touched my hand, but she didn't move it right away, but looked at me with a small smile. I felt my heart beat faster, but I didn't say anything because I didn't know what it meant, and just continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. We finished the living room, moved to the kitchen, and I washed the dishes while she wiped the table, and all this time I was thinking about how close she stood to me when we were together. After cleaning, we sat on the couch to relax and I turned on the TV, but I didn't turn it up because I wanted to talk and not just sit in silence. I asked her if she was bored spending so much time at home and she said that sometimes it was, but since we started talking more often, it felt better and she was glad that I was there. She sounded sincere and I told her that I liked being with her too because she made me feel understood, which is something I had been missing for a long time. She looked at me and I noticed that her gaze lingered on me longer than usual, and in that moment I realized that I was starting to see her as more than just a stepmother, but someone closer. We sat in silence for a while, and I could feel the air between us getting heavier, like we both knew something was going on but weren't sure what to say. Then she said she was going to make some tea and stood up, and I stayed on the sofa, watching her go, wondering what to do with this strange feeling that was growing inside me. She came back with 2 mugs, put them on the table, and sat closer to me than before, so our shoulders were almost touching, and I didn't move away because it didn't feel wrong. I took the mug and sipped my tea, and she asked me what I was thinking about, and I told her I was just glad we were spending time together and I didn't know how I would cope with this loneliness without her. She smiled and put her hand on the back of the sofa behind me, and I felt her fingers brush my hair, but she didn't take her hand away. She left it there as if it was natural. I turned to her and our eyes met, and I knew I wanted to be even closer, although I couldn't say it out loud because I was afraid it would change everything between us. We sat like that for a while, drinking tea, talking about small things, but I could see that she felt the tension too, which was growing with each passing minute. As the day began to wear on, I said I was going to my room to do my homework for college, and she nodded, but I noticed that she was watching me until I disappeared behind the door of my room. Lying in bed that night, I thought about her hand touching my hair and how I didn't want that moment to end, and I realized that our relationship wasn't the same anymore. I was scared to think about what would happen next, but I knew I didn't want to stop because I felt alive with her. A couple of days after cleaning, I woke up thinking that I wanted to be closer to Sarah than before, because every conversation and look we had now seemed like more than just a conversation. Dad left for work early, I heard his car drive away, and I stayed in bed thinking that today something was going to change between us, even if I didn't know how it would happen. I got up, washed my face, put on a tight t-shirt and short shorts, went downstairs, and found Sarah in the kitchen, where she was standing at the table in a light t-shirt and jeans, pouring coffee, and didn't notice me right away. I walked up to the table, said good morning, and she turned around, looked at me from head to toe, and said that I looked good, and then asked me to sit with her. I sat down opposite her, she put a mug of coffee in front of me, and we started talking about some trivial things, but I saw that her gaze lingered on me longer than necessary, and I myself could not take my eyes off her hands, which were lying on the table. Then she said that she wanted to watch something in the morning to distract herself, and asked if I would keep her company, and I said yes, because I had nothing to do, and I wanted to be near her. We went into the living room, I turned on the TV, chose some random movie, and we sat on the couch, but she immediately moved closer to me so that her thigh touched mine, and I felt the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her shorts. The movie was playing, but I wasn't paying attention because all I was paying attention to was the way her hand was resting on the back of the couch behind me, her fingers brushing my neck as she pushed my hair out of my face. She turned to me and said that she liked how close we had become over the last few days, that she hadn't felt this way with anyone in this house in a long time. I told her that I liked it too, that I didn't want it to end, and she leaned in closer until I could smell her skin mixed with the coffee she was drinking. Her hand slid from the couch to my shoulder, and I felt her fingers squeeze me a little tighter than usual, but I didn't pull away because I liked it. I turned to her, our faces so close I could see every detail of her eyes, and my breathing became heavier because I knew we were on the brink of something that couldn't be undone. She ran her hand down my neck, her fingers lingering at the base, and I felt her nails lightly scrape my skin, sending a shudder through me, but I didn't stop her. Her other hand came up to my hip, and I felt the pressure of her palm through my shorts, and it was so unexpected I almost leaned forward, but I held back because I knew we shouldn't go too far. She looked at me, and I saw her chest rise more than usual, and I knew she wanted the same thing I did, but we both stayed silent. I put my hand on the couch next to her hip and my fingers accidentally brushed against her jeans and she didn't pull away, but instead moved even closer so that her knee was now pressing against mine. Her hand on my neck slid to the back of my head and she squeezed my hair, not hard, but enough that I felt my body tense from the contact and I closed my eyes because I couldn't hold her gaze. She leaned over so that her hair fell over my shoulder and I felt her breath become hot on my neck and it was almost unbearable because I wanted more, but I knew that Daddy was somewhere in there and this was all wrong. Her hand on my hip tightened and I opened my eyes to see her looking at me with such intensity that it was hard for me to breathe. We stayed like that, her fingers in my hair, her hand on my thigh, and I could feel my body shaking with tension because I couldn't stand the distance between us any longer. She leaned in even closer, her face so close I could feel her if I took a step, but then there was the sound of a car outside the window, and I knew Dad had come home sooner than we thought. Sarah pulled away abruptly, took her hands away, stood up, and went into the kitchen, and I sat there, trying to catch my breath and pretend nothing had happened. When Dad came in, I said hello to him, and Sarah came out with water in her hands, and we both pretended everything was normal, but I knew this moment would stay with me for a long time. Dad came home and Sarah and I pretended nothing had happened, even though I could still feel her touch on my skin. He asked how my day had been and I told him it had been quiet and Sarah said we had watched a movie and he nodded, not noticing the tension between us. We had dinner together and I went to my room, thinking about what had almost happened and how it could have changed everything for our family. As I lay in bed, I realized I didn't regret what had happened, but I knew we had to stop because it would only get harder. Sarah was still important to me, but I decided that moments like that would never happen again and I needed to move on without looking back.